Thank you. Firstly, on behalf of all of the speakers here today, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. My name is Carmel Flynn. I'm the Director of Health Protection for the Department of Health and Human Services. I'm also an enthusiastic member of Victoria's Gender and Disaster Task Force, and I'm the host today of this very special event. To open this Claire Zara Memorial Oration, please welcome from Women's Health Goulburn North East, Deborah Parkinson.
This is a fine event and a fitting conference within which to remember our dear friend and colleague, Claire Zara, and her legacy to the emergency management field. A warm welcome to Claire's friends and family who've travelled to join us for this significant tribute. John is here from Wangaratta and Claire's daughter Sarah from Brisbane. Our sincere appreciation to Steve O'Malley from the Metropolitan Fire Brigade, Mark Sweeney, Tony Poole and the conference organisers who responded so positively to our request for this inaugural Claire Zara Memorial Oration. Its inclusion as a plenary session with everyone in the room here today is testament to Claire. It's evidence too of a growing urgency from the emergency management sector to understand the implication of gender roles to health, well-being and equality. When Claire spent days on the phone at Women's Health Goulburn North East soon after Black Saturday, finding out who to talk to and how to help, it was the first step in her journey of discovering the deep relevance of gender to disaster experience. Equally, it was her first step in a substantial body of work that's brought this defining issue to the table. In 2009, there was little literature on gender and disaster in Australia. Claire's motivation for venturing into these largely uncharted territories, as always, was to make a positive difference to people's lives. Claire recognised injustice and spoke up. She saw something and she did something. Like the women she interviewed, Claire wanted system change to prevent women in future disasters suffering in the same way. She wanted case managers to be trained to recognise domestic violence and know how to refer. She argued for effective services to be in place to deal with referrals, and she strove for attitudinal change. She wanted professionals and community members to hear women speak of the violence against them, even if it was hard to hear, because men were suffering after Black Saturday. And these were our boys, good men, heroes. Her open and inquiring mind meant she was keen to hear from men too. There were other stories to hear, and feminist that she was, Claire meant to hear them. After these interviews, Claire wanted greater freedom for men to speak of their pain beyond the walls of an interviewing room. She advocated for more effective services for men and more supportive employer responses. She felt so strongly that she began work on her PhD at Monash University, greatly impressing the panel at her confirmation milestone last November. Her topic was men's experience of health and well-being during and after Black Saturday. After a lifetime of observing, thinking, reading, studying and living, Claire's insight distilled the essence of the problem. And distill she could. She could write the catchy headline or astute phrase that resonated with people. She could cut through and communicate with panache. It is truly a loss to international disaster studies that Claire can't continue her path-breaking work, a term used by the international foremost disaster and gender scholar, Elaine Ennison, about Claire's work with men. As her family and colleagues well know, the work was not easy. Vicarious trauma follows the immersion in people's stories that characterises qualitative research. And Claire took it even further, pushing research into practice. With Rachel McKay, she developed and presented training on domestic violence and disaster, and again bore the brunt of pushback from both community members and emergency management professionals keen to reject any challenge to the status quo. One of my father's favourite quotations was from Adam Lindsay Gordon. The Australian poet famously wrote, "Life is mostly froth and bubble. Two things stand like stone. Kindness in another's trouble, courage in your own." I know this to be the way Claire lived her life. Her free spirit and her delight in people in the world were contagious, and her sense of humour legendary. If she were here today, she would be on the edge of her seat, eager to learn from the three eminent leaders on our panel, rapt that Liz Broderick is one of them. She would be keen to get to the bottom of the phenomena and the solutions to find new ways to change the world. And she would be happy and proud to see Susie Reed, Helen Riseborough and Frank Archer together on this stage to mark another important step. Claire didn't just ask questions and compile answers. She looked into the eyes of the women and the men she interviewed. Without fail, when they looked back, they saw a woman with a heart and a purpose, a woman with insight and intelligence to convey their story, their survival, sadness and frustration. If the purpose of a memorial oration is to remember a life lived well and to inspire, Claire's is such a life.
It is a very special occasion, and the next session also marks a milestone for those working in the area of gender and disaster, and that is the launching of the Gender and Disaster Pod. Women's Health Goulburn North East and the Monash Injury Research Institute have been particular drivers of this important work. So to launch the pod, please welcome from Monash Emeritus Professor Frank Archer, and from Women's Health Goulburn North East, their CEO Helen Riseborough, and to speak Executive Officer Susie Reed.
I am standing here today because of the very important part that the late Claire Zara played in the establishment of the GAD Task Force and the GAD Pod, which we are launching now today. Claire was as much respected and admired member of the Women's Health Goulburn North team, of which I am their executive officer, and who was a passionate feminist researcher who loved to gather and present the voices and stories of vulnerable women and men to improve outcomes and make a difference. Claire was an extraordinary character. She was, as I have mentioned, a staunch feminist and a very, very funny, charismatic woman who had a great ability to engage with anybody and everybody. We welcome her family and friends here today, especially John and Sarah, her daughter. Claire was, as they say, a mover and a shaker. And I have to tell you, when I typed it in, it said shocker, and she was that as well, as we well know. And she played an enormous part in the momentum that has led us here today to this launch. The launch is a testament to also the vision of the three organisations, to Helen from Women's Health in the North and Frank from Monash Injury Research Institute, and their boards who have supported us. Equally, it reflects the broader support of around 25 leaders within the emergency management sector who sit on the GAD task force, which I co-chair with Craig Lapsley. These senior representatives come from emergency service organisations, from academia, non-government sector, and of course community. When we meet this month, it will be the 8th meeting in addition to a very well-worked working group, which we've had numerous meetings. The task force is just one of the many initiatives supported and overseen through this GAD pod. Its development followed Claire and Dr. Deb Parkinson's, a highly respected researchers, work over the last 6 years, all of which you can read about on our GAD website, and you'll get the steak knives when you do. The work, both carried out by Deb and Claire, has resulted in 2 major awards. The Resilient Australia Award, sponsored by the Attorney General's Department for Gender and Disaster, Leading the Change, in the category of Projects of National Significance. And in 2013, they got the Victorian Health Promotion Foundation Award for Family Violence After Natural Disaster Research, breaking new ground, in the category of Knowledge and Understanding. We have gratefully received funding, I'd like to say very gratefully received funding, from a range of key emergency resources, including the National Disaster Resilient Grant Scheme, Emergency Management Commission of Victoria, Department of Health and Human Services, and the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. The launch of the Gender and Disaster Pod here is exciting, given the conference is the foremost emergency management conference in Victoria and in the presence of such an eminent panel. In an age of technology, it really is a virtual launch with a website at its heart. The future is exciting as there is a great deal of interest in the subject, both here and overseas. We have forthcoming conference presentations in Adelaide at the Australian Fire and Emergency Services Authority Conference and in Hobart at the Population Health Conference. And there is more, a forthcoming chapter in a book with the CSIRO. Most excitingly, we will be trialling 4 training packages, and you'll hear about more of this when you read our webpage. And there's a new bit of research that is coming too, all of this in the next 6 months. Just one initiative of the pod is the Roadmap project, which is the result of the vision of Carmel Flynn, who engaged us. We need your help to refine and evaluate this work. The Roadmap is a guide to the wealth of resources available to all of you. Give it a go. It takes 5 minutes, and we'd love to hear your opinion, your voice. You'll find it around the corner, so if you go out the door, past the icebreaker and down the side, you'll find the computers there all set up. Please just give us 5 minutes. But now, while you've all filled the room, is to hear our eminent speakers. So here is the launch, and a special thank you to Claire Zara for the part she played. Thank you.
Well, now over the next 15 to 20 minutes, we're going to hear from each of our 3 special guests on why gender inclusion is an important topic for our sector and what brings them here to talk to us about it. So our first very special guest speaker is Elizabeth Broderick, Australia's Sex Discrimination Commissioner. During her term, Elizabeth has been committed to improving gender equality. She's been a key advocate for Australia's national and parental leave scheme, paid leave scheme, and for family violence reform. She's worked closely with the Australian government and other organisations to strengthen gender equality. Elizabeth is the global co-chair of the Women's Empowerment Principles Leadership Group, a member of the World Bank's Advisory Council on Gender and Development, and a member of the Australian Defence Force Gender Equality Advisory Board. She's also an ambassador for the Foundation to Prevent Violence Against Women and Their Children, and the overall winner of the 100 Women of Influence Awards for 2014. Please join with me in welcoming Elizabeth Broderick.
Thank thank you very much, Kamal, for that beautiful introduction. And I want to thank Susie and Deb as well for their really such honest, truthful words about Claire. And it's fantastic. I just think it's such an honour to be here to actually speak at the inaugural Claire Zara Memorial Oration, and to also be here to speak. And Claire would have loved seeing that this program has moved into the main part of the 15th Annual Emergency Management Conference agenda. So I also want to acknowledge my two distinguished co-speakers. I have to say, one of the things I've learnt as Australia's Sex Discrimination Commissioner is that when powerful, decent men step up and start speaking about gender equality, that's when we have change. And I just want to recognise the great leadership of Angus and also of Dominic. Thank you. As I said, I was touched to have been asked to speak at the event today, and I want to take a moment to personally acknowledge Claire and the pioneering efforts she made to get gender recognised as an issue in disaster response. I met Claire last year when she interviewed me after Victoria's Gender and Disaster Task Force meeting. And what struck me about her is how she was truly an agent of change. She was kind and compassionate. She had the ability to sit with human suffering, not to let it overwhelm her, but actually to take that emotion and to step up and create systemic change. And I really admire that in individuals. She realised that she had to take the case for change not just to people's heads, but also to their hearts. She epitomised the maxim, and this is what one woman told me in the United Nations just 2 months ago when I asked her, how do we create change in the world? She said, she did what she could when she could, and that's how she changed the world. So thank you, Claire, for putting this issue of gender fair and square on our nation's agenda. And as I was sitting listening to the orations, I realised that, you know, as a mother, and I'm a mother with a 17-year-old daughter, mothers are great role models for their daughters. So I know that the work she does absolutely lives on in the views you have about gender equality. So what I want to do today is to start to look at the issue of gender inclusion within the emergency management sector and to really put out, I suppose, one key message. And I like to describe it as human rights starts at home. Because so many organisations I see, they're worried about gender equality out there in the community, but they're not living the message within their organisation. So today I'll draw particularly on some of the work that I've done working with the Australian Defence Force and in other male-dominated industries, from organisations like McKinsey through to Rio Tinto, through to police forces, mining, construction and utilities. And just coming back to the ADF, many of you may know that over the last 5 years I have led an independent review into the treatment of women in the ADF. I originally started working with the ADF a couple of years before when Angus was Chief of a Defence Force and realised that actually gender equality was an important issue. It wasn't about being nice to women, this was about capability, and that's when I first started to work together with the ADF. One of the key questions that we were asking at that time was, why are there so few women and so few women with children in key leadership positions? And I remember the analysis we did. We looked at the top 200 leaders in the ADF, and what we found is that over 90% of male leaders had children, but less than 18% of female leaders did. The message was clear. If you want a strong career in the ADF, you've got a choice, family or career. And that's something that needed to change. The other thing that needed to change was not to transform the warrior culture to move away from that. I mean, a warrior culture is very important in underpinning a combat fighting force. But the challenge was to make the warrior culture more inclusive, so that it was an inclusive culture where both men and women could serve as equal partners. And I think what we can draw from the findings of the work that we've done in the ADF is useful when we look at a sector such as the emergency services sector. The key to change, I've found in any organisation that I look at, those that are doing it well, it's about courageous leadership. Leaders who understand the imperative for change, who get it both head and heart, personally committed to it, who implement positive and sustainable strategies, and who hold those who undermine change or who demonstrate unacceptable attitudes and behaviours, hold them to account. They're the leaders that move forward. And this is true for leadership, not just at the CEO and most senior levels of the organisation. We need leadership in the middle ranks, those who lead teams and units. Indeed, those who sit in the middle of the organisation, they're the keepers of your culture, the cultural ambassadors. They are the ones that set the tone. So if they don't get on board, then it's very, very difficult to move ahead. One thing that struck me when I was preparing for this speech is it's very hard to get the data about the numbers of women in the sector and exactly where they sit. Indeed, I was able to get from the Victoria State Emergency Service annual report in 2014 that there are 106 male employees and 61 female employees in that organisation. But I wasn't able to understand where those women sit. Are they in particular jobs or roles? Are they sitting at the most senior levels or the more junior levels? I think the starting point to moving ahead is getting the numbers and making them transparent. But I would imagine that if emergency management is like our defence force, like our police forces, what we see is a high degree of occupational segregation. So we see women clustered around clerical, administrative, health, those types of areas, logistics. And not only that, we see low levels at the senior levels of organisations. I mean, I call it the basic rule, and that is that the higher up you go in most organisations, the less women you'll see. That's as true as taxes and gravity. So it's the same picture in many male-dominated industries. And when we talk about why we need to change, why do organisations need to embrace gender diversity? It's actually not about being nice to women. This comes down to core capability. And I often say to organisations, and I know I said it when I was working with Defence, the fact is in the last 2 decades, 20 years, 1.6 new female entrants have entered Australia's labour market. And when we looked at the Defence data, we decided, well, that's interesting because not one of them has decided to come to the ADF. Of course they came to the ADF, but they came at the same rate that they left. So indeed, we didn't see any uplift. And I can't tell without some more detailed analysis of and some greater ability to get the data, but I would posit that that's probably a reasonably similar picture in the emergency services area. So when it comes down to it, this is about talent. It's about capability. And just to give you one story of that out of the ADF, I often asked, why is it that women need to come into infantry? That was a question that was asked of a Chief of Army, Lieutenant General David Morrison, not so long ago when he was with his troops beyond the wire in Afghanistan in Oruzgan province. And he said to his troops, he said, look, can I ask you, you've been out here for several months, how many of you have actually spoken to an Afghan woman? Well, not surprisingly, the answer was 0, for a whole variety of reasons, part of which are cultural. So the Chief's question back was, well, how can you provide human security for the entire population when you can only speak to half the population? That's a capability issue. And increasingly, when we see about the inclusion of women in male-dominated industries, it's about capability. Not only that, the data is absolutely clear. It doesn't matter what study you look at, greater levels of gender diversity, particularly at the senior level, are correlated with better performance. Not only that, if we could fix this picture here in Australia, what we do know is from some recent research, if we could close the workforce participation gap between men and women by 6%, that would deliver around $25 billion to our economy. So what I've seen encouragingly over the last few years is that many leaders are stepping up in male-dominated industries because they've recognised they need to access the best talent. So they're doing something more than just turning up the volume on the standard modus operandi. they're doing three things. Firstly, they're stepping up their leadership on this issue. They're making it a top priority. They're looking at what I say, how I act, what I prioritise and what I measure. 4 aspects of their leadership, and they're asking themselves, am I being the leader I need to be on this particular issue? They're holding others to account, and they're exiting people from their organisations who fail to live up to the values around inclusion and respect. So that's the first thing they're doing. The second thing they're doing is they're disrupting the status quo. They're doing that by recognising that if we don't actively and intentionally include women, then the system will unintentionally exclude them. That's true because most organisations are deeply rooted in a male way of being, a male norm. So we need to actively and intentionally include women. And that means more than just pouring in a few women and stirring. We need to redesign the structures, the behaviours, the attitudes, so that they're inclusive of both men and women. So that's the second thing they're doing. And the third thing they're doing is taking a strong stance on sexual harassment and sexual abuse. Because not only does that destroy individual lives, it divides teams and ultimately it will damage operational effectiveness. So that's really why we need to care about it. But as one woman in the ADF recently told me, she said, look, a lot of the problems we face, we all just shrug off, oh well, that's part of the military and it's just the way it is. I would question whether it needs to be like that and whether it should stay like that forever. Thank you very much.
Earlier today, my colleague Mark Sweeney from the MFB introduced our next special guest, Sir Angus Houston. I won't reintroduce his long list of achievements, but I will refer, and particularly in light of Elizabeth's tips on leadership, to the advice that Angus gave us earlier in regard to his preferred leadership model. He said to lead by example, to stay calm, to set the right direction and make that clear to everyone. He said to work for the welfare of your people and to empower them, and then they'll follow you. When I heard Angus say this earlier today, I reflected that 20 years ago I was a young military officer, and that was at a time when women made up about 10% of the whole Defence Force. Angus was my commanding officer. I didn't know you could get promoted above a commanding officer at that time. I was that young. But I'm here to say to you all these years later that he has always been as good as his word. Because in that environment, I was very young, I was very much a minority part of an extremely strong masculine culture. But I worked for Angus and I did feel supported and empowered, and I still feel privileged by having had that experience of working with one of Australia's most respected leaders. Please join me in welcoming Sir Angus Houston.
Well, for the second time today, I'm up here. Can I start by first acknowledging Claire Zara's family? I'm deeply honoured to be able to speak at this very important occasion, and I pay my respects to you for a wonderful lady who was courageous and a great advocate for women throughout her life. And I think it's very sad that she's not with us today. In terms of the panel, I'm obviously I know Elizabeth very well, as you've already heard, and I'd also like to acknowledge Dominic. I think what I might do is just a few reflections. I remember very well when I was with Carmel all those years ago, and at that stage we only had a couple of women pilots on 86 Wing, which is the biggest wing in the Air Force. And those young women had a torrid time entering what was a very blokey culture, a long time male-dominated culture. They needed a lot of support and a lot of help. In terms of leading by example, I can remember insisting on having a flight with Linda Corbould, who was the most senior of the women that were coming through, and flying as her co-pilot. I thought it was very important that the commander of the wing should fly with a very talented, very able pilot as co-pilot. And I remember that night very well. We flew at night, and she was magnificent. And it's important that leaders lead by example, and that's the sort of thing that I did very early on. When I became Chief of the Air Force, I ran into a few people that I knew, young women, and I agree with everything that Elizabeth said about it's a family or it's a career. And I ran into a couple of young officers who just had children. And I said, oh, how old are your children? Oh, they're at school now. I said, well, why aren't you back in the Air Force? She said, oh, well, it's too hard. I'm not allowed to come back part-time. Can you imagine that? And this is in the early 2000s. So I went straight back into my people and I said, we're missing out on a lot of great talent with this stupid policy of restricting people who come back into the workforce with full-time service. So lo and behold, Jane came back part-time. It didn't take her long until she was working full-time. She was actually doing 3 days in the office, and then she used to take the work home to be with the kids. And we got an incredible enhancement in our logistics capability because of that young lady, and indeed the others that came back under the same terms. One of the things that really used to frustrate me about defence was that we actually got the culture, we actually got the terms and conditions right, the conditions of service right. At the time, no organisation in Australia had better conditions of service for women than defence. The problem was that down at the lower level, the commanders were not implementing the policy. And there was a lot of what I would call unconscious bias, and maybe some quite deliberate bias against women. The sort of thing that used to happen, a woman would get pregnant, she'd go off on maternity leave, and then when she came back, she was less senior than those who were in her cohort because she'd taken time off. What a travesty. We've changed that around now. If a woman goes off and has a baby, she comes back and she retains her seniority. She doesn't go backwards. But that was the sort of nonsense that was evident when I was Chief of Air Force and when I first became CDF. And we changed the policies to make sure that we were kinder to women. Now, as CDF, when I got into the job of CDF, I'm ashamed to say that we had 1 2-star, 1 1-star and 7 colonels. So a total of 9 senior officers who were women in the Defence Force. By the time I left 6 years later, with the great help of my reference group, and Elizabeth was one of those reference group, I might add the other ones were Christine Nixon, Sam Moyston, Christine Charles, Margaret Gardner and Elizabeth Proust. Quite a few Victorians on that list actually. Very enlightened ladies, and they gave great assistance to me in dealing with these, I think, very challenging issues at the time. Well, by the time we left, we had, there'd been 3 ladies who'd been through and had achieved General Officer rank. There were 7 1-stars and there were 30 colonels. We had increased from 9 to 38, an increase of 29, the participation of women at the senior level. But it didn't stop there. The journey continued. In 2015, I checked the statistics the other day, we've got 2 women who are 2-star, 11 who are 1-star and 53 colonels. So we're now up to 66 women who are at senior officer level. We've gone from 9 to 66 in 10 years. Now, I think that is an achievement, but the point I want to make today, this is a long journey. It won't be done in, one command term, one chief commissioner's term. It's something that has to be ongoing, and I absolutely agree with you, Elizabeth. It's about leadership. Leadership is the lifeblood of every organisation that is successful that I know. If you have good, strong leadership, you get good outcomes. And I must say, we can't throttle back in the ADF at the moment. We can't say, and I'm not in the ADF anymore, by the way. I'm closer to the Victorian Police than I am to the ADF at the moment. More on that in a moment. But essentially, we've got to keep working to increase the level of participation in women. And just to give a sense of how hard it is, if we look at the overall participation levels, that's all women in the ADF. Carmel mentioned 10%. Well, where we've got to at the moment is the following situation. In the ADF, we've gone from 10% when Carmel was a young officer, 20 years ago, Carmel? By 2010, it was 13.6%, and in 2015, it's 15.3%. I might add the biggest jump in recent times has been Army. Now, one of the things I did when I was CDF, and there was a lot of organisational resistance to this, I recommended to government that women should have the opportunity to join the arms corps in Army. There were restrictions against them being infantry, artillery, armour, all of these things. And after a very good discussion and strong recommendation from the Women's Reference Group, I went to government. I said, we need to change the policy. Women need to be able to go to combat if they so desire, or into the combat cause if they so desire. There'd always been this hurdle that was put in front of women, and it was something like this: women aren't strong enough to carry an 80-kilo pack, or they can't do this, or they can't do that because they're a woman. Well, gender should never be a discriminator. The discriminator should be physical capacity to do the job and intellectual capacity to do the job. And there are many women in this day and age who have the physical capacity to do everything that a man can do. And those women, if they want to go into the ADF and do those very demanding combat corps jobs, they should be allowed to do so. And indeed, that is what is happening now, thanks to the very strong leadership of David Morrison and David Hurley, and of course now Mark Binskin and Angus Campbell. So we're on the right journey. It's a long journey, and it's important that we go through to finish that journey. And I agreed with everything that Elizabeth said about the ADF. And it will require active, constant leadership and a very inclusive culture, not a blokey culture, an open culture that invites both men and women to participate in the exciting business that has to be performed. Now, just a couple of other observations. I help Victorian Police. I sit on the Command Executive. I'm chairman of the Corporate Advisory Board. I saw a wonderful leader, Ken Lay, who is very much in the right space as far as participation of women is concerned. And in the middle of today, I was actually at the Command Executive, and we looked at the figures for recruitment. 50% of the recruits in the Victoria Police right now are women. The other 50% are male. That's what we need, because as Elizabeth said, the Victorian Police now have full access to the whole Victorian community, not just 50% of it. So that's important. I'm also chair of Air Services Australia. We have, unfortunately I should have brought a slide, but we're having great difficulty getting women into the firefighting business, the Aviation Rescue and Recovery Service, or ARF as we call it. Now, One of the things that we've done in recent times is we are actively intervening to make sure that we don't exclude women. One of the things we've done, we've looked at recruitment end to end, and we've just checked that there's no unconscious bias against women. Again, it's about physical capacity. So we've got to target the right women. So the advertisement that's gone out is this. There's a young woman there who's obviously very fit, and the caption is, "Stay fit, save lives." And a lot of women are being attracted to the fire service through that advertisement. And indeed, on the last course, we had, by the way, a year ago, the level of participation of women in the fire service in air services was 1.6%. Right now it's just up to 2.8%, and on the last course, 26% of those who graduated, 3 were women and 3 were Indigenous people. We had excluded Indigenous people too. And that's a huge step in the right direction. But it needed active intervention by the Chief Executive Officer, Margaret Stabe, who many of you might know, a very good woman leader to get that sort of outcome. So why is this important? Well, it's all about equal opportunity. It's all about accessing 100% of the population if you're recruiting. You can't just rely in this very competitive day and age on the male part of the community. You've got to have the women as well. And in the Australian Defence Force, that's an imperative because we need to be able to sustain the capability into the future. And if you look at the demographics, we are going to be short of young people to recruit in the future. David, the story about David Morrison, I'll tell another story. A very impressive Special Forces commander that I know. I sent him off to Afghanistan. He came back. I said, "How did it go?" He said, "Oh, it went very well." I said, "You know something? We took young women out with us on the engagement activities that we did out in Uruzgan province. And you know, sir, we got all the women came out because we provided a clinic provided by these young women, and we engaged all of the women and all of the men. Prior to that, it was only men. So straight away, can you see the enhancement? Here you are, you're trying to win hearts and minds, and up until then you'd only had access to the males, no access to the women's. You provide a medical clinic and you get access to the other 50%. Clearly you're going to be in a much better position to win the hearts and the mind. I just finish by saying it's all about leadership, and gender should never be a discriminator when it comes to job employment or participation in emergency services or any other job in our community. Thank you very much.
Our next guest speaker is Dominic Lane, who's the Commissioner of the Australian Capital Territory's Emergency Services Agency. In this role, Dominic provides strategic direction and management of the ACT's emergency services, including the ambulance service, fire and rescue, rural fire services, and the State Emergency Service. Dominic brings with him 28 years of operational experience, as well as 10 years in senior executive leadership and strategic management. He's the Deputy Director of the National Aerial Firefighting Centre, a Director of the ACT and South East New South Wales Aero Medical Service, and a member of the Australian Bravery Decorations Council. Coincidentally, I'm assured, Dominic has been awarded a number of decorations, including the Australian Fire Services Medal and the National Medal. Please join with me in welcoming Dominic.
Thank you very much, Carmel. It's indeed a pleasure to be here, and not only to acknowledge obviously the wonderful oration in relation to Claire, but the launch of the Gender and Disaster Pod, I think, is a tremendous way forward for emergency services as a whole as we continue to at least start to get better at focusing not just on response to emergencies, but our preparation for and our response and recovery arrangements thereafter. I was asked two questions today which I thought were quite timely in relation to some work we're doing within the ACT. One question is, why is gender inclusion an important topic for emergency management? And the other is, what makes this an important subject for you on both a personal and professional level? So as I turn to the first question, and I thought of the terminology gender inclusion, and I thought of fire and emergency services, and the exact terminology that came to my mind was gender exclusion. Because for the last 100 years, and that's what we've done. I'm not going to say here today whether that's right or wrong or whatever, but our history does clearly demonstrate, particularly in the realm of fire and emergency and even in paramedicine, it has been a male-dominated environment for most of the last century. You've only got to look at the images you've seen in the past of the hero fireman dragging the young woman, beautiful usually, from the burning building to resonate, I suppose, about what we're trying to attract in some of our people in the past. It's a bit sad for me that that particular poster still sits in one of my office's rooms today. But not only in terms of the last century, we could also look to the last 10 years and wonder whether we're making any difference or not. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, particularly in relation to Liz's question about what are our statistics in fire and emergency services. But of course, it's not only in urban fire services where we have diversity gaps. Amongst our volunteer rural fire services and emergency services within the ACT, and certainly what it seems is nationwide, there are still significant gaps. And I find that quite an irony when you consider we rely so much on our volunteer services in our rural and regional areas, where we still continue to pull less than 1/3 of our membership from more than half the population. And surely there's got to be something that can be done there to increase our capacity in this ongoing dialogue I hear about we're losing volunteers in the bush. Well, maybe if we went to all the potential volunteers in the bush, they might not necessarily be the case. I think for me, some of what the other speakers have spoken about are incredibly important. I think everyone in this room, you wouldn't be here otherwise if you didn't understand the importance of diversity comes together for capability. And we know the science demonstrates some of the wonderful work our Bushfire Cooperative Research Centre has done over the last, and Natural Hazards Centre, the most recent CRC, is doing, clearly demonstrates the importance of diversity in incident management teams and in decision making. And we know when we have balanced decision makers, we get balanced and profitable outcomes in all parts of society. The same very much applies in the emergency management realm, where decisions have to be made so quickly and where lives depend on it. But also at the closer level for our own firefighters itself, I think it is incredibly important that we consider what is the future of our diversity and what is going to make a stronger fire service. As Commissioner of the ESA, I don't want smoke divers. I don't want men running into burning buildings just for the sake of it, or smoked out areas or places that put themselves in danger for no apparent reason. I want good firefighters that can take measured and calculated risks, understand the dynamics of the situation and work towards fully saving lives, not only in a response phase, but as I said before, in preparation and preparedness. And I am convinced that we will only be able to do that properly when we have a more diverse workforce. Some of our stats, they're really pretty embarrassing. In the ACT, we have 2% women in our urban fire service. Across the other sectors, much better, but still a lot of room for improvement. Angus has already spoken about what that means for aviation firefighting and rescue service, and the challenges they face there are very similar to ones we face here in the ACT. One of the more interesting statistics I thought of, last year I came into contact through Steve O'Malley with the Women in the Firefighting Association, which is a wonderful group of people that comes together to promote women in emergency services nationally. I think, Steve, you have something like 138 members. There are 247,000 people working in fire and emergency services here in Australia. I think that's the most telling stat. So we've got a lot of work to do. It doesn't mean not a lot has already been done, and I acknowledge many people who have gone before me that have started to promote this. Many women are starting to come through, but we have too many barriers. When I looked at our statistics within ESA and the 2% firefighters and nearly 30% total average of women across our organisation, where was it in 2006? 2% firefighters and nearly 30% across the organisation. So we have not moved. There's many reasons for that, and we can't go through all of those today. But some of the things that have happened in the ACT in recent times have led this to be a very important topic. So much so that we've made it a government priority and part of our significant reform agenda that we're undertaking within the ESA to increase the participation rate for women, remove the barriers to them and promote our organisation as a wonderful place to work, as indeed it is. But we have been subjected to recent criticism quite fairly in relation to issues in relation to sexual misconduct and sexual harassment. It is something of which, of course, as Commissioner, I am not proud. We're working very hard, though, as an organisation to make sure we don't repeat the sins of the past. And we all know in any organisation misconduct can occur and harassment can occur. I think the most telling thing for ESA was how poorly we actually handled those particular issues, and to a certain extent, embarrassingly, still do to this day. So I suppose I sit here today, I suppose I'm standing at the moment, but anyway, I stand here today in amongst some very eminent people in this field. This is a topic that's very new to me. As you heard there, I've been in this industry for nearly 28 years, but it's only in the last 2 years that these issues have really come to light, and I'm starting to get a much greater grasp of the barriers faced by women attempting to get into emergency services and be promoted from within. We've got a lot of work to do, myself and my colleagues. It's wonderful to see most recently the AFAC board, the Australasian Fire and Emergency Services Authorities Council, agree to take up the issue of gender as a national priority and place far greater significance on that. I think we will still continue to see improvements. We'll work very hard. I won't speak because Erin's going to talk about some of the wonderful things her and her team have been doing in relation to the Women in Emergency Services project in the ACT. But as General Morrison has said to me, it is a hard road to hoe, but we can only start with the first step, and that's what we've taken within the ACT, Emergency Services Agency. I think on the last note, I'll just go back to some of the learnings that I've had over the last 12 or 18 months as I've become much more involved through conferences like WAFA, through our own facilitated workshops we've run in ESA, where it took those for me to truly understand the barriers that women face in our organisation and, dare I say it, in other fire and emergency services nationally. Many of those women do see themselves at the vanguard, but it is a terrible pity in this year of 2015 that that is still the case, and we are indeed very far behind other sectors and industries in both private and government. So we'll continue to do that work and we'll see where that takes us. Thank you very much.